Hello there, I'm George Hall, and welcome back to the Good Growth Podcast. Now, today we're bringing you the second part of our Introduction to Good Growth Technology episode. So back at the start of May, I was lucky enough to sit down with Jake Clarkson, who is now Good Growth CTO, to discuss all things acquisition and all things GGT. Well, Jake, we kicked off last episode with quite a tricky question of simply, who are you? And then I guess another fairly tricky one, but in terms of an elevator pitch of kind of what do we do as a company? What is it that makes Good Growth special and Good Growth Technology special? And how do we go about doing what we do in the best way possible?
I think there's an important thing in terms of how the businesses came together, because both businesses, again, frankly speaking, in the sort of reality of business, there are overheads to meet. Both being relatively small businesses, at least, similar size. Good Growth being give or take 20, Amigo at the point of acquisition being 7 or 8. So so we had to sort of marry up the desire for the make the most of the new versus the sort of pragmatic need to meet overhead. And of course there is legacy clients from both businesses. Just the practicalities of having to communicate with them, bring them up to speed. But of course the flip side of that is to excite them. We've got something new to say. So I think in this first quarter, firstly it's been really exciting. It's been great to bring these two businesses together. I think it's fair to say at this point we've had a really great reception for the new proposition, and there's a legacy of doing things a certain way in Amigo, a legacy of doing certain things in Good Growth. And what we were really keen, when I and other leaders of Amigo were starting to have the conversation with Good Growth, the picture that we used, sort of mental image as a guiding principle, was that we're not just take a Venn diagram. We're not just looking for some kind of intersection between what was Good Growth and Amigo. We're looking for a completely new space, almost, which is a new business, still called Good Growth, but logically a completely new business where we take the best bits from both businesses, we leave behind, and not just leave behind implicitly, but just consciously say that these are things we want to leave behind. This is an opportunity to do so. So, in terms of how I would articulate the proposition now for Good Growth, it is to enable or to give insight and enable innovation at speed within current constraints. I think there are 3 parts to it. So there's insight and innovation, part 1, at speed, part 2, and within constraints, part 3. And these things aren't mutually exclusive, but I can unpack and talk a little bit about them. So the insight and innovation, this is the what, I suppose. What do we do, and what do we mean by insight, and what do we mean by innovation? So the insight part we can think of as somewhat synonymous with the data. Sure. And the history that we have in Good Growth of delivering great data work, whether it's modelling, or whatever it is, back to that the decide or the hypothesis generation. So we've got a great legacy there. So that's the idea of insight. So, for example, given a data set, which could be typically from Google Analytics, could be Adobe Analytics, could be increasingly from, I should say Amigo is now Good Growth Technology, or GGT. So think of those all as synonymous. So given a data set, using our intellectual property models that we've built up over the years, what insights can we give to you? Then with innovation, I like to think of innovation in 2 ways. So it's, for me, closely related to this idea of testing. So if we take a look at closely related to this idea of testing. So with testing, and I'll go to our old friend, the dictionary, or at least what Google says. When Google tells us everything, now maybe ChatGPT does. Maybe I should have made that request. But anyway, to test. So it's to take measures to check the quality, performance, or reliability even of something, especially before putting it into widespread use or practice. So this idea of testing something. Then innovating is to make changes in something established, especially by introducing new methods, ideas, or products. So with innovation, we're typically dealing, in some ways we can think of innovation as being somewhat synonymous with with risk. So innovation is, the outcome isn't known. It's, I want to try something that is, aligned with what we've done historically. We as a potential client of Good Growth, it's going into new territory. It might not work. So I'd like to combine the two and to think of innovation in that sentence. I'll talk a little bit more about innovation and why there are challenges around it in a minute. Something like to introduce new methods, ideas or products into something already established and test performance before putting into widespread use. So we've sort of joined the two together. So what's historically been the preserve of testing, sort of relatively unambitious as defined by conversion rate optimization tools typically, we like to have that speed and freedom and ultimately de-risked approach to innovation that looks like and feels like testing. So the process of innovation should be testable is a core belief. So back to the core sentence, to enable insight and innovation at speed within current constraints. So at speed. So we can take two potential approaches and sort of, via thought experiment, play them off against each other. So we could say, well, one way to innovate might be to get again speaking as if I'm a client of Good Growth, get our internal resources to do the work. And, that's one way of doing it. And I'll come back to why that's a potential challenge, aside from the obvious lack of resource, availability of resource. So that's one way we could do it. Or we could do it through Good Growth, which is, and so how do we differentiate ourselves? Why go with us as opposed to through traditional means, should we say? And so if we're not delivering this at speed, then we fall foul of some of the existing challenges with innovation. I think I would draw out maybe four challenges that one might face when trying to innovate. One's lack of resources, which we've touched on already, and I think it's particularly relevant at the moment where we're all operating in a tough economic climate. We're on the 3rd of May 2023, just for those listening back. It's pretty tough out there. There's uncertainty in multiple dimensions. And so, innovating, I think, as well as, we talked about it being somewhat overlapping or adjacent to risk. At the moment, risk-taking isn't maybe particularly at the top of people's list. So with budgets being squeezed from, software engineers, UX designers, they're all in high demand, but, low supply. And there's a general lack of resource available to innovation, to innovate. Secondly, another reason for why innovating might be hard is organisational complexity. So going from which will increase exponentially with size of organisation. For those of us that have worked in large organisations can attest to that. So going from an idea to a delivered solution will likely require the traversal of multiple teams, multiple time zones, multiple committees. So it's quite a daunting exercise when you know that what you might be putting forward doesn't have back to the innovation, not having a defined guaranteed positive outcome. When you're trying to go through this process, you've got to sort of psych yourself up, and get ready for that. And it's something that maybe one doesn't do. There's frankly is cost. So again, let's again as thought experiment say, I want to innovate. Replace innovate with risk. I want to take risk. And now I come to cost. I want to take risk. Give me some money to do that. It takes a certain. Of course, there are organisations out there that encourage that. Typically, ones that have lots of spare cash. Let's be frank. So there's actually less risk. But so let's say I'm coming and saying I want to take risk and getting budget, getting cost to do that. Whether it's actually cost or resource, implicit cost through allocation of existing resource. The process of innovation at the moment, given the organisational complexity, given the lack of resources, is going to be expensive. And then related to that is time. And so, investing months, again, this is through traditional innovation methods, investing months in something that may or may not yield a meaningful commercial benefit is a hard thing to sell. And so how do we solve for those things? How do we allow businesses to move at speed? And that comes on to the third point. I will pick up those specific 4 points as well. But there's the final part of the sentence, which is, enabling insight and innovation at speed within current constraints. So within current constraints, that's a key point. And so we're almost the philosophy that we've brought in, which interestingly Good Growth had prior to Amigo joining, but something Amigo explicitly had. And this idea of approaching the problem in a different way. So we've talked about some of the reasons why innovating in large enterprises, really any business, can be challenging. So the lack of resources, the organisational complexity, the cost, the time. So if we are to put forward a credible solution, we can't start to, our solution can't be sort of embedded or entangled with those current ways of working that exhibit those issues. So we have to come up with otherwise it's just bound to fail. It's going to be subject to the same issues. Even if we limit it to, lack of resources, then we can say, so again, to play a thought experiment, if we say, we can do it without your resources, but it's going to take 10 years, then, that's not a credible solution. So we have, again, back to working at speed. So we have to approach this in a different way. Mm-hmm. And the way, and the most concise way, something that was very, I feel very personally very passionate about, is this idea of innovating within constraints, constraint-based transformation. Is why, necessity is the mother of invention, all this kind of stuff. And how do we do that? And so we have a technology that we've developed. And it's important to state that what we're selling as Good Growth is what I've said. So it's insight and innovation at speed within current constraints. Our technology won't solve all problems by itself. That's the fact. It has to be placed into this sort of philosophy of innovating within constraints. And I'll talk a little bit more maybe later about how we do that. But if we, as a mental image, imagine almost a chart, so X and Y axis, because this applies to our data side of the business as well. And so let's say at the moment, when we meet with a client, our job is to establish what are those constraints within which we can operate, and that'll vary client by client. And so let's say on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we have doing stuff on the website or on web-based properties, and on the y-axis, the vertical axis, we have what can be done in the data space. So the clients, will be able to do stuff online. They'll be able to do stuff in data land that likely have Google Analytics. And so what they can do at the moment, we can think of as defined as what you can do with regard to data, what you can do with regard to tech and enacting change. And that gives us a square, as it were, or rectangle, probably more likely on this hypothetical chart that we're picturing. We can then imagine a third axis, sort of z-axis depth of speed. And so this combines to what can be done within constraints when we meet a client and at what rate. So, the speed. So our job in Good Growth is to expand essentially all three of those axes. So in terms of what can be done, so in combination using our technology, so Good Growth Technology, GDT, and our software development expertise, we can extend what can be done on the horizontal axis, that of tech, or what can be done on the site, web properties, and then on the data axis, through our intellectual property, through the models that we've built up, our expertise working with clients' existing data sets, and they don't have to be perfect, by the way. Again, part of operating with constraints is that we just take what we're given and work within those constraints. We can extend the vertical axis. So we're now seeing that if we leave it there, we've expanded this in a sort of x squared, sort of exponential benefit we've got at this stage. We then add in the speed axis. And here we want to increase speed, of course. And so we increase the z-axis and we get an x cubed. So that's the mental image I use personally, is how can we maximise the space and the rate of change of how we allow our clients to innovate. So yeah, that's how I think about the technology, and in terms of good growth, it's insight and innovation at speed within current constraints.
Well, that was the second part of our Intro to GGT podcast, and it was great to hear more of what Jake had to say. Now, as always, we may have left you with answers, we may have left you with questions, but either way, it would be great to hear from you. We're Good Growth, a data and technology business trusted by global brands to grow market share and profitability of e-commerce and digital channels. You can email us at inquiries@goodgrowth.co.uk or have a look at our website, which is goodgrowth.co.uk. We'll be back next week with the third and final part of this episode. Thanks for listening.